of the world drew their own conclusions when they found gigantic bones or huge jaws filled with dagger-sized teeth.
You can imagine what the ancient Chinese thought as they came across a dinosaur splayed out in the ground. It looked just like dragons.
During Cretaceous times, the part of the world that is now the Gobi Desert was inhabited by small, plant-eating dinosaurs known as protoceratops. The discovery of their fossilized skeletons, more than 2,000 years ago, may have given rise to the mythological half-bird, half-mammal known as the griffin.
They have a bird-like beak, they have 4 legs, they have a long tail, and they have these very long, slender shoulder blades. And occasionally the skeletons will collapse and those shoulder blades will stick up really high. And that's exactly where the griffin's wings are supposedly attached.
Before science, it was often up to religious scholars to try and provide acceptable explanations for all of the giant, mysterious bones being discovered. One of the first was given by St. Augustine.
In North Africa, he saw a giant tooth, giant fossil tooth, probably a mastodon, big thing. A mastodon tooth looks a lot like a human molar, and he wondered how could there have been a human-like life form so gigantic and now extinct. He searched Genesis, and in chapter 6, he finds the description of these mystery people, hybrids between angels and people. They were evil giants, and they were wiped out. And he said, could this be?
Hundreds of years later, the question still remained unanswered. In 1677, an English reverend and museum curator named Robert Plott correctly identified a dinosaur fossil as a petrified bone, but he described it as the thigh bone of a human giant. It wasn't until the 1800s that people were beginning to accept the possibility that the fossils belonged to some strange, non-human animals.
As fossils began to be studied in great numbers, serious philosophers, Thomas Jefferson being one, looked at these fossils and said, what is the message there? Could nature allow wonderful animals to go totally extinct worldwide? And he told Lewis and Clark, when they went to the American West, be on the lookout for mastodon bones, for live mastodons, for mammoth turds, any evidence that these animals might still be alive somewhere.
Of course, in their travels across the continent, Lewis and Clark found no such creatures. Was it possible that certain plant and animal species had simply vanished from the Earth? The evidence seemed overwhelming, and by the 20th century, dinosaurs became synonymous with extinction. While some held out hope that a few survivors might still be found in an unexplored jungle, or in the depths of Loch Ness, such notions were most often dismissed as sheer fantasy. Then, towards the end of the 20th century, when just about everybody on Earth was convinced that all dinosaurs were extinct, scientists changed their minds.
If you want to find living dinosaurs, you don't need to go any further than just out into Central Park and look at the pigeons. Birds really are living dinosaurs.
Today, thanks to feather impressions being found in Asia, much of the exciting new work in paleontology is focused on the bird-dinosaur relationship. Most paleontologists are now convinced that birds are directly descended from one group of carnivorous dinosaurs. This radical new mindset not only changes the way we perceive dinosaurs, but also impacts the way we look back at the traditional history of dinosaur paleontology.
So we were feeling pretty proud of ourselves in the late 1990s. We had discovered this new thing, brand new thing. Dinosaurs were lizards, they were birds. But it's not a new thing. It's the original idea. The very first man to devote his life to the study of dinosaurs was the Reverend Edward Hitchcock in the 1830s. He studied dinosaur footprints. He didn't have bones. And from footprints alone, he figured out that what we call dinosaurs were in fact what he called a prehistoric subclass of ground-running birds who didn't fly, but had feathers covering their bodies and moved swiftly in packs and ruled the Earth in the Jurassic. That's a perfect description of Velociraptor.
But Reverend Hitchcock's conjecture, based on footprints, was completely overshadowed by the findings of another reverend on the opposite side of the Atlantic, who based his conclusions upon fossil evidence. In 1824, Reverend William Buckland of England described a jawbone and teeth that appeared similar to that of a monitor lizard. The creature was given the name Megalosaurus, which means great lizard. Around the same time, an English country doctor named Gideon Mantell discovered the teeth of another creature which he dubbed Iguanodon, because he thought they were similar to an iguana's. Once again, dinosaur remains were being compared to modern reptiles. In 1841, preeminent British paleontologist Sir Richard Owen coined the term dinosauria, meaning terrible lizards, to categorize all of these prehistoric creatures.
Generally, the early paleontologists thought of dinosaurs as being large reptiles. And the problem with that is that introduces certain misconceptions. You start to think of dinosaurs as behaving the same way that modern reptiles behaved. And that clearly wasn't the case.
In 1854, Sir Richard Owen and artist Waterhouse Hawkins designed cement statues of the dinosaurs being found in England for the opening of London's new exhibition hall, the Crystal Palace. The sculptures still stand, but contain several anatomical errors. Both the Megalosaurus and Iguanodon were depicted as four-legged creatures. Later discoveries of more complete skeletons proved them to be bipedal. Putting the nose spike on the Iguanodon was another mistake. It turned out to be the creature's thumb. But to the general public, these anatomical errors hardly seem to matter.
What's really important about the Crystal Palace dinosaurs is the fact that they brought these animals for the first time to the public at large. People could go there and see them. They weren't scientifically accurate by any stretch of the imagination, most of them, but people could get a sense of their size and their majesty and the fact that these look like really strange, bizarre, alien creatures.
Dinosaur fever had begun. It soon spread to North America when the Wild West was found to be littered with fossils. Paleontologists had hit the mother lode, and the race to collect them would become known as the Great Bone Rush. Paleontologists that search the world for dinosaur bones are part scientist, part prospector, and part adventurer. Life in the field hasn't changed much, despite the many technological advances made over the last 160 years.
We use GPS to get our location. We use satellite imagery sometimes. We use helicopters to do a lot of digital photography, aerial photography. We use computers for all sorts of things. But basically, to dig up a dinosaur, you need a pick and a shovel and sometimes a jackhammer. And when you get close to it, you use little brushes and camel hair brushes and awls and masonry tools. It really is still very basic.
In fiction, paleontologists have often been portrayed as mild, professorial eccentrics, or the ultimate big game hunters. In fact, the truth is somewhere in between. While many people may dream of becoming a paleontologist, it takes a special kind of person to devote his or her entire life to uncovering the secrets of the Earth's ancient past.
I traveled all around the world and met just about every working paleontologist there was in every country. And there's something that happens to somebody when they start thinking in deep time. They're sort of not of this planet. They're not of the same time-space continuum of the rest of us. They're thinking, an idea of a long time is 65 million years ago, not what they had for breakfast.
Finding dinosaur bones is not all glamorous Indiana Jones type work. Field work for instance, is extremely grueling. You can be up there at the crack of dawn, and then you're working out there in the hot sun all day long. It's very time-consuming. You could be out there for a full season and not get anything except a tan.
Not all fossil hunters are paleontologists. This was especially true in the early years, when amateur or commercial collectors made some very important discoveries. But they often received little credit because of the mistaken notion that only those affiliated with established institutions could make significant contributions to science. One of the earliest of these commercial collectors was a woman named Mary Anning. She collected fossils around the seaside town of Lyme Regis, England, in the early 1800s.
She eventually put that town on the map by her knowledge of fossils and her collecting abilities, which was recognized by scientists from all over Europe.
She would go to the Natural History Museum in London, but her social position and her condition as a woman impeded her from getting into the circle of paleontologists in London that were studying all these fossils. And she couldn't attend the university either, being a woman.
She kept on collecting fossils until her death. She died when she was 47 and had a marvelous career with many discoveries of animals from those cliffs in Lyme Regis, things like ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, the swimming reptiles that were so much loved by the public in the first part of the 1800s.
Another of the lesser-known but important early bone hunters was an English schoolmaster named Arthur Lakes. Lakes journeyed to America in the mid-1800s and made an incredible discovery near the small town of Morrison, Colorado.
He was hiking, they saw bones. Pieces of bones that eroded out. They were gigantic bones. And he dug. And he made contact with museums back east. He got some advice, but basically he was self-taught. And he arguably is the greatest of the self-taught dinosaur hunters. And he brought back to life Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus and the first Stegosaurus, all of the wonderful beasts of the Jurassic period.
One of Arthur Lake's most important contributions was the scientific record he created. His drawings and watercolors helped identify the locations where he worked, and his detailed use of color indicated the types of sediments where the bones were found.
During his own lifetime, Arthur Lakes didn't get a huge amount of publicity, but he had a very good career here in Colorado. The big guys back east, Professor Marsh, Professor Cope, got most of the credit.
Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope became, unquestionably, the two greatest names in 19th century paleontology. Famous for their important discoveries, and infamous for the highly publicized feud that developed between them.
Marsh was the head of Yale University's Peabody Museum, and Cope was the head of Philadelphia Academy of Sciences. You know, like all great rivalries, they started out as friends. And they were, go out in the field together, look for dinosaurs, look for fossils, and actually, name fossils, in honor of each other.
What set off their rivalry was the fact that Cope, who was very profuse in his publications about dinosaurs, had sort of rushed to publication this paper about an elasmosaur, which is a giant seagoing reptile with a long neck. And in his paper, Cope put the head of the elasmosaur on the tail instead of on the end of the neck. And Marsh was inelegant enough to point this out in public.
Having a mistake like this held up to public ridicule by Marsh was humiliating to a dedicated scientist like Cope. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The two men hired crews, headed west, and the Great Bone Wars was on. Their competition in the fossil fields of Middle America became legendary.
Luckily for science, it was one of the most productive feuds in history, because in that period of time, we're looking at 1860 to the 1890s, almost half of all the known dinosaurs of that period were discovered by O.C. Marsh and Cope.
The Bone War, which was actually a bone rush, in a way, sort of wound down. The public interest had waned. Both men had spent vast amounts of their own personal fortune to sort of out collect each other. And they ended up in poverty, and it was really sad.
But even as death approached, Cope tried to continue the rivalry. He decided to donate his body to science and issued a final challenge that Marsh should do the same. Cope wished to have their brains removed and measured to see, once and for all, who had the superior intellect.
So he did this. He had his skeleton boiled down, and he had the brain preserved, which, unfortunately, though, I guess Marsh never decided to take Cope up on the bet and did not have his brain preserved. And so poor Cope's brain is now still sitting up there in a jar somewhere in Philadelphia.
With the passing of Cope and Marsh, dinosaur discoveries weren't headline news anymore. But soon, there would be a new invention on the scene, the movie camera, which would thrill the public in a whole new way and seemingly bring dinosaurs back to life.
Winsor McCay, who is a highly popular cartoonist, came up with the idea of doing an animated film, and he produced Gertie the Dinosaur. Gertie the Dinosaur was not only the first animated cartoon about dinosaurs, it was the very first animated cartoon ever.
Winsor McCay's choice of a dinosaur to star in his film was most appropriate. What better animal to bring to life on film than one which was extinct? With Gertie's debut in 1912, dinosaurs began to evolve in a whole new way. Into some of the biggest movie stars ever to appear on screen. By the turn of the 20th century, the notion that enormous creatures called dinosaurs once roamed the earth was readily accepted. The public was now ready for the next big thrill. That's when three men, Charles R. Knight, Willis O'Brien, and Roy Chapman Andrews, entered the picture. They succeeded in making paleontology exciting to the public and dinosaurs more than just some old bones in a museum.
Charles Knight was born in the 1870s, and since he was a child, he became interested in art and in animals. He studied art at the Metropolitan Art School and at the Art Students League in New York City. He also started spending a lot of time at the American Museum of Natural History in the taxidermy lab. He became well known among the scientists in the museum, who were very impressed with his curiosity and his serious interest in animals.
Charles R. Knight is probably the most important paleoartist who ever lived. He was really the artist who defined dinosaurs for the rest of the world. The reason his work had such an impact was twofold. He was not only able to convey the scientific information to the public, he did it in a powerful and dramatic way.
Knight went on to create an enormous body of work for museums in New York and Chicago. He also painted murals of the more recently extinct mammals that lived around the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. Knight's art created a new level of experience for the museum-going public. They could now see depictions of the animals in life, as well as the bones themselves.
He had a really important impact, I think, on the science also. I think that if you look at a lot of his paintings, one sees some things which weren't really prevalent ideas even at the time, but just because that he was such an expert in animal anatomy, he figured these things out. For instance, he had tyrannosaurs mounted much like our mounted Tyrannosaurus in, a horizontal position with its backbone parallel to the ground.
Charles R. Knight was a huge influence on movie makers, one of the main ones being Willis O'Brien. Willis O'Brien was the special effects wizard who created the dinosaurs for the 1925 Lost World, and he based all of his dinosaurs upon Knight's work. It was a way of bringing Charles Knight to the screen.
The Lost World was based on the 1912 novel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. The film tells the tale of an expedition to a remote part of the world where dinosaurs had survived extinction. The Lost World made some of the same mistakes that almost all dinosaur films have made ever since. In the film, species from the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods interact, even though they existed millions of years apart. Also, the size of the dinosaurs was often exaggerated. But in several ways, The Lost World was ahead of its time. In his quest to bring drama to his film, Willis O'Brien created dinosaurs that, in many aspects, are now seen as being more accurate than the scientific opinion of the 1920s.
One of the things that really interests me about paleontology is when non-paleontologists get involved with it and actually provide speculations that the paleontologists may have overlooked. An example of that is in Lost World with the protective Triceratops. At the time, the general perception was that dinosaurs were too stupid to have any kind of organization or protection or society, that they were just born and then went off on their own. And in the film, a mother Triceratops gathers and protects her young. Well, that's very forward thinking if you think that we really didn't discover evidence of that until the late 1970s and 1980s.
I vividly remember seeing Willis O'Brien's The Lost World in 1925, and that stuck in my mind for years, this dinosaur particularly falling off the cliff. Of course, at the age of 5, it's hard to distinguish reality from fantasy. So I thought it was real. Apparently, Conan Doyle showed a group of scientists, and everybody thought it was real because no one knew much about stop-motion photography at that time. So the dinosaurs were considered a real image on the screen.
One of the reasons people believed that these dinosaurs were real was the primitive technology of filmmaking back then. The dinosaurs were just as jerky in their movements as a lot of the people in some of the shots. And so there was a consistency, an overall consistency to the film product that people were viewing.
For some audiences, the creatures on screen seemed even more realistic because the newsreels of the era often featured the exploits of a real-life dinosaur hunter named Roy Chapman Andrews.
Roy Chapman Andrews was an incredibly colorful person. He was swashbuckling. He traveled all over the world. Anyone who's seen images of him knows that he had a big impact on sort of popular culture of the 20s and 30s. He may have been some of the inspiration even for Indiana Jones in the sense that, he wore a fedora, he always carried a 6-gun, he wore high boots and a leather jacket in the desert all the time.
Andrews became the world's most famous dinosaur hunter in an unlikely way. He really wanted to work at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, but lacked any real qualifications. So he started there as a janitor and eventually worked his way up to curator. Andrews' drive and charisma made him the perfect figurehead for an ambitious expedition to Asia to look for the remains of early human beings.
And once again, as it has happened a number of times in paleontology, serendipity played a major role there, and they didn't find any remains of early humans, but they found some tremendous dinosaur remains, some fossils that clearly changed, once again, the history of dinosaur paleontology.
The discovery of dinosaurs in Europe, Africa, America, and now China had a powerful effect upon the general public. People were amazed that these incredible creatures had once roamed the entire world. The museum's trips to China and Mongolia became known as the Central Asiatic Expeditions. During the trek in 1923, Andrews' expedition became renowned for discovering a nest of eggs, thought to be those of a Protoceratops.
However, Roy Chapman Andrews really wasn't a great scientist, and that everyone credits him with these great dinosaur discoveries. He was a wonderful expedition leader, but he actually never even published a single paper on dinosaurs themselves. The chief paleontologist was a man named Walter Granger, who was in the Department of Paleontology here at the American Museum, and he really was a scientist, and he actually is the one who I think should be credited with the great scientific successes of the Central Asiatic expeditions.
What Andrews lacked in scientific expertise, he made up for in another important aspect of museum survival: fundraising.
because these things are very expensive. The Central Asiatic expeditions in the 1920s, when you look at the costs, they're quite impressive. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. The first expedition that used a whole fleet of motor cars in combination with 100 camels is a pretty dramatic affair. So he knew how to do that, and he knew how to promote an expedition to raise the money for it.
One of the things that made Roy Chapman Andrews very effective in raising funds for the museum is that he was one of the first paleontologists to take along a movie crew. And those films got sent back to the United States and became parts of newsreels and made Roy Chapman Andrews famous, made the American Museum of Natural History even more famous, and was instrumental in piquing public interest in paleontological adventures.
Chapman's fame proved how important the media could be in raising interest and funds for further exploration. But due to circumstances completely outside of his control, the Central Asiatic expeditions came to a quick and unexpected end.
By the end of the 1920s, because the political climate was changing, the American Museum was basically thrown out of China and of Central Asia and not allowed to work there anymore.
As the Roaring Twenties came to a close, Charles R. Knight was still painting, and Willis O'Brien was trying to launch a new dinosaur film project. But the Great Depression and the coming war in Europe would make it increasingly difficult to keep dinosaurs in the public eye. By the end of the 1920s, the search for dinosaurs had suffered a 1-2 punch. The American Museum of Natural History's expeditions into Asia had come to an end because of political unrest in that part of the world. And with the onset of the Great Depression, funding for dinosaur projects had practically dried up. One of America's most prolific dinosaur hunters, Barnum Brown, did manage to get further exploration underway by finding sponsorship from Sinclair Oil, which in 1930 adopted a dinosaur as its company logo. But over the next 40 years, dinosaurs remained in the public eye primarily through the movies. Ironically, it was a great ape that gave them their most memorable starring role.
Looking back on it now, we are tainted by what we've seen today, but for the day of King Kong, it was the most spectacular event ever to come on the screen.
King Kong premiered in 1933 and was the Jurassic Park of its era. Kong lived on a tropical island filled with survivors of the Mesozoic. The special effects were designed by Willis O'Brien, whose on-screen